All right, everyone. Thanks for waiting. Oh, we've just hit 1:30, so we will get started on today's webinar. So for our dealer webinar, today's topic, we're going to talk about manual handling. Our reason for talking about manual handling from a dealer perspective is because when you look at the workers' compensation data, so this is pulled together by WorkSafe Victoria, and it is their injury hotspots, and they base it on workers' comp data. So when you look at in the automotive industry, what is the cause of most injuries? Now we're looking at over 50% of the injuries in industry are relating to manual handling, strain or sprain injuries. And you can see that 16% of those are back injuries, and they're coming from postures, lifting, etc. Shoulder injuries, again, mostly from lifting. So that is why it is really important that we have a focus on manual handling, identifying our risks and controlling them before we have injuries. So we're going to have a look at how you identify your manual handling risks. So at what point does manual handling go from being an acceptable task to a hazardous task? And then how can you control that? And I will show you what tools are in the dealer safety manual that you can use to help you easily and quickly identify those. And then there's lots of information as well in the manual that you can use to help you select your control measures as well. So with anything, we kind of got to look first at what the regulations tell us we need to do in regards to manual handling. So whether you are using the model WHS laws, which is most of the states and territories in Australia, or whether you're in WA or Victoria with your own laws, the definitions within the regulations are very similar. So I've summarised the definitions. Manual handling is any time we are exerting force to lift, pull, hold, restrain, anything. It becomes hazardous when it is repeated or sustained, either awkward posture or repeated or sustained movement, or there is the application of high force. Now, repetitive means we perform it more than twice a minute. Sustained means we hold that posture for more than 30 seconds at a time. We'll have a look in a second at also long duration. This means we do it for more than 2 hours over a shift or 30 minutes at a time. And then high force doesn't just mean, oh, it exceeds a certain weight. High force can be a lower weight, but if we're using smaller muscles to manage that weight or that force, it can also be high force. But we will talk to that as we go through. So the regulations give us those definitions. They then tell us we have to identify hazardous manual tasks or hazardous manual handling, depending on which laws you're using, depends on whether you use the term task or handling. We must determine controls. Now, they don't all use the term using the hierarchy of control, but that is the implication in the regulations. You must use the hierarchy of control, which is, can we first eliminate the hazardous part of manual handling? If we cannot reasonably eliminate it, we can then consider other controls. And I will talk about controls when we get to that. The regulations, so say we identify the hazards, we must control those hazards. It also tells us we must review those control measures. And our Act tells us we must provide people with supervision and training. So that you have to remember that that's also a requirement as well. So I want to help you out when you're thinking about what tasks might you have where you need to consider the movements that are occurring at your dealership and whether or not it or has the potential to be hazardous manual handling. Things to consider are within parts, anything that relates around the movement of stock, high force or this sudden force. The movement of heavy items or large or bulky items are also difficult to move. So people who are picking parts, even doing stock take, because looking at your postures and movements when you're doing stock take, any loading or unloading. So that's where your key things in parts are going to be. In servicing, a lot of servicing activities, use of tools, movement of parts, your postures whilst either working within an engine, whilst under a hoist, under a dashboard. And then we might have some high forces in, especially if you're working with heavy parts or heavy tools. Even sometimes like if you're moving something and it's a small part or thing that you're moving, but it requires a lot of force on your fingers or something, which are small muscles, that could still be a high force. Other things to consider in service are vibrations, slippery surfaces, whether these are slippery surfaces on the ground, meaning your ability to balance yourself or your grip, but also the grip on your hands and your tools, and whether that's going to add to any manual handling risk and add the potential for it to become hazardous. Even within administrative roles and your sales department, there will be some manual handling tasks with the potential to be hazardous. Anything with sudden movement or even just any movement of equipments and items. Probably a big one would be sustained postures, sedentary work. So use of computers, when you've got to work on the movement and setup of displays, even the movement of vehicles around the showroom, because we're dealing with movement of vehicles in a constricted space and area, and the movement of office equipment and boxes and things. So some tasks to consider there. And in the yard area, I think the main thing would be looking at postures, and you would be looking at things like washing vehicles, movement of gates or barriers, and vehicle movement again. So just to get you thinking. So now when I talk about how you identify hazards, what parts of a manual handling task are hazardous, you can now think in your mind some of those risks that I've just mentioned, and I want you to give them consideration in your mind and your dealership, how you do these tasks, and whether or not you think anything flags as hazardous. So how we can identify something as hazardous, there are a few steps that under the guidance material. So this is from the codes of practice, the compliance codes and the national standard, that we are told we can, ways to identify the hazardous part, consulting with workers of the task. And it's not in the dealer manual, but every code of practice does have a discomfort survey. But whether you formally or informally did this survey, really just talk to people and ask them, is there any task you do where you feel pain or discomfort? If so, what part of your body do you feel that pain or discomfort? So that's what the discomfort survey is. And I think it's easier instead of looking at another piece of paper to just talk to people and ask them that question. The main way we identify hazardous components of manual handling is through observation of tasks, and we use a tool to help us, and I'll show you the tool in a minute. You can also use industry and authority information. So if we look back at this is telling us the industry and the authority information is that in a dealership, the most likely injury, 16%, will be in the back, and it's going to be muscle stress or strain from heavy lifting, bending, pushing, and pulling. So already you're now being flagged the types of work and the posture or movement to consider. So we're thinking heavy lifting, also thinking the bending and pushing and pulling. So we're now already been given some prompts. Does a task involve heavy lifting, bending, pushing, pulling? If so, we should consider doing an assessment of those tasks. And then your own injury data. So where are the injuries occurring? Within your own dealership, if you're having injuries, do they occur predominantly in one area of the dealership, doing a particular task or a couple of tasks? So just give that kid, you just got to assess your own data and come up with that. So I've already given you those definitions. So we won't go through them again. So I said that you would use a tool. Within Section 8 of the Dealer Safety Manual, there is a tool to help you identify your hazardous manual handling. This is step 1 of the tool. You can either list where it says task steps, grab this over, where it lists task steps, you can either list, if you've got a big task, you can list each of the individual steps of the task so that you're breaking down your assessment and making it easier. Or if you're if you're in an area and you want to look at multiple tasks, you can write down multiple tasks. And then you note, so to know whether you want to do a further, more detailed risk assessment of the task, let's just first identify, is there anything repetitive or sustained in it? Is there anything with high force? Is there anything that's sustained or awkward posture, repetitive movement, or exposure to vibration? And then those definitions of what is repetitive, sustained, and high force are at the bottom of the worksheet, which is cut off just for the purposes of this webinar. So this is like our initial prompt sheet to go, do I want to go into more detail? If your answer to all of those questions is no, then you can end your assessment at this going, it's a manual handling task, but there is nothing hazardous about the task. If you answer yes in any of those boxes, you will do a further assessment, which I'll show you in just 1 second, which will tell you the exact component of that task that is hazardous. You are also allowed, if you have multiple tasks that are very, very similar, just say, like things like the setting up of your displays. You're not just going to set up a display in one area, you might be doing it in multiple areas. So if there's no other factors which might alter the assessment from one area to another, you may do that task assessment as a group of tasks. You may group that task together and do it as one assessment instead of going, I have to have 3 assessment documents. You can do it as one. So that might also help you. So if you've got tasks that are very similar in nature, they can be done as one assessment. So if you click yes or tick yes, you go, yep, it's repetitive or sustained movement. You then go to step 2. Step 2, and then so step 2 has 4 sections to it, and I'm only going to show you a couple of the bits because you can open the manual and have a look through the tool yourself. It contains a lot of really detailed questions. So we say, does the task involve, in black, does the task involve repetitive or sustained postures, movements, or forces? And remember, so we're saying repetitive was twice per minute or 30 seconds at a time. And then, but not only that, it's saying, it's giving us the specific movements to look at. So, reaching behind the body, squatting, kneeling, carrying, lying. So this is about page and a half long for the repetitive and sustained postures. To identify bending your back, going back more than 5 degrees, but forward more than 20 degrees. So with everything, you know, your head, your arms, whatever movement is like the natural movement, you know, you've got bigger movement, you get about 20 degrees movement before they start to flag as hazardous, and bending backwards, it's always, you know, so it's like a 5 degree movement. So 20 degrees, 5 degrees, at least they keep it consistent for us. So those are your the questions. So you say, are we bending the back? Are we bending the back forwards more than 20 degrees, either twice per minute or for 30 seconds at a time? Yes or no? So this is where the task observation occurs. And so you go through that. The questions on 1A are about a page and a half long. So there's about a page and a half of these very specific movements to yes or no. There is then also some on, let me pull it up for you. This is the, so there you go. So that was the first section. There's the second. Does it involve a long duration? Long duration being 2 hours over a whole shift or 30 minutes at a time. Does it involve, and then step 2 is high force almost. So like I said, high force is not always a weight limit. High force depends on the movement, whether even sudden movement. So if you're carrying items that are unbalanced or unevenly weighted and they have the potential to suddenly move, that can be high force. The next section, the most important question, got it up, is step 3. Is there a risk? So what you've just done in step 1 and 2 is identified the hazard component of the task. Now you have to determine for sure if there's a risk. So it has to be repetitive or sustained and a long duration. So you had to have said yes to somewhere in step 1A and step 1B to say, yes, there is a risk, or there needs to be a high force. So the moment you have high force, yes, that is a risk, which was step 2, saying yes at step 2. So this is a very critical component because it says there is a risk. If you had said yes somewhere at 1A, but not at 1B, so the long duration as well, then you would have a hazard but no risk. So the chances of someone being injured are not high enough to require you to put controls in. If that makes sense. So this is saying, but if you say yes to 1A and something at 1B, we have a risk, we must put in controls. So now we're going into controls. So now we've identified we have a risk, this is hazardous manual handling, we must put in controls. The law wants us to take into consideration first, can we eliminate the risk? Eliminating the risk did not say eliminate the task. We don't, automating a task is one way to eliminate a risk because we now no longer have a manual handling component. But what we have to eliminate is the hazard. What here was the hazard? So it might only be a component of a task that you need to eliminate and not the whole task. So just consider that. So automation, altering a task, the product, the tools you use, things like that might help you to eliminate it. So then if it is not possible, or they say reasonably practicable, which we talked about what reasonably practicable is last month, then you can consider altering your workplace or your tasks in another way to reduce the hazard. So I'm going to say we're going to look at the substitution next. Substitution means we swap the hazard for something less hazardous. This might mean we have a heavy item. So we now we now handle a smaller, lighter item. So if we had a box, we now separated the product into 2 boxes that are lighter. Keeping in mind, you've now added to the number of times you're performing a lift, but we've removed the hazardous component, which was the high force. Keeping in mind, make sure that that now hasn't increased the number of movements to exceed repetitive over a long duration. But that's one way of doing it. Substituting, another example might be for using, I said, sometimes the high force can be our fingers, like trying to open something or trying to install a part or push a part in or take something out. Can we use a tool to help us do that, to give us the leverage? We are still performing a manual task, but we've now made it easier to do, to the point where we might reduce the risk. So substitution is the next thing to consider. Then next is engineering or isolating. Can we, without altering the hazard, reduce a person's exposure to it? So this is like putting a barrier between the workers and the hazard. So this could be mechanical aids, trolleys, adjusting height tables. So on some level, the hazard is, the hazard is kind of unchanged, but we're changing the way that we interact with the hazard to reduce the staff's exposure to that hazard. Lastly, if it is not possible to do any of the above, and you have to have very good reason why none of the above are feasible, you can consider using administrative controls, or typically administrative controls are there with something in the above. So the administrative controls are your training, instruction, work procedures, but even things like rest breaks, job rotations. So we said, long duration can be doing it for 30 minutes at a time. Can we get rid of that 30 minutes at a time and that total of 2 hours? So when you're looking at this was a hazardous part of the task, it might be a posture or a repetitive movement, but remember it was also a long duration. So what else can we alter about that hazard to reduce the risk? PPE, again, in regards to manual handling, there's not a lot of options, and they're only going to be very minimally effective in regards to reducing the hazard. But it may be things like fatigue mats, heat-resistant gloves, shock-absorbent shoes, slip resistance. If you identify that the grip on tools is not good, then maybe you need some gloves that help you with your grip, so that you're reducing the force you need to apply. So it's not just the, but it's so what your risk was initially depends on what control is going to be most appropriate. Obviously, if you have something that is a higher risk or more likely to cause injury, you were going to consider a control measure higher up in this table of controls. But if it's something where there's a chance of injury, but it's not very likely, and it's not likely to cause a lot of harm, you can use things lower down. Or you might use multiple things. So we're gonna train people in how to use our gloves correctly whilst also giving them a new tool. So worth considering. Now, review and monitor controls. So I said the law said we must review and monitor our controls. What does this mean? First of all, we need to consult people prior to making our decision on what control measure to use. We will consult them after we've started the implementation. So if you say like review it after a trial period, we might need to consider short and long-term controls. If you say this is a really big risk to us, the movement of this particular part is a risk to us, but in order to change the way we move it, we need to redesign the workplace layout. This is going to take time to do. Is there a short-term control? You know, can we use team lifting for a short period of time until we've managed to rearrange our stock in our warehouse to fit it in better? So we might need to consider that, not just one control, but is there something short term if it's a high risk, and longer term because availability of controls or how long it's going to take you to get in new equipment, you might just need short and long term. Make sure that we update our work procedures to reflect any new equipment, any new process, or the way we do things, or what's not allowed to be done. We need to train staff in the control measure, the correct use of the control measure, maintenance of the controls. Also, training staff in general manual handling techniques, and even this risk assessment process and methodology, so that your staff are aware of at what point does manual handling become hazardous. If they know that at 20 degrees and 5 degrees, twice per minute or for 30 seconds at a time, if they knew these are the trigger points for a hazard, they might change the way they choose to perform tasks as well. Or they at least know when to tell you, I think this is a hazard, can we assess it? Reviewing our risk controls. So we should always trial our control measures when we put them in place, and after a month or 2 months, depending on whatever you feel for that hazard is needed for it to kind of start to be in place, we should always review it to check, one, it has reduced the risk per your expectation, it has not introduced any new hazards, and is there anything additional the staff might need to help them with that hazard. Next up, the dealer safety manual. I just wanted to show you what else is within the manual that you can use. So one of the key things is that tool right there. So I'm just trying to open it up. Here we go. Here's the dealer safety manual. This could be really useful to you guys. Sprain and strain risk controls. It is literally like, this is the risk, force or exertion. Here are some potential risk activities, and here's the controls that go with those risk activities. Floors. Have we got fluids or contaminants on the floors? Here's the potential risks and potential controls. So that's like 3 pages long, really quite specific things. Useful if you're wanting, you know, if you're going, oh look, I don't know how to control this, here's some points to go to. Also, the compliance codes and codes in practice have loads and loads of pages on example controls as well. This lifting table, like I said, there is no set weight given to us within the law that says you can or can't lift a particular weight. But there is guidance material out there, especially from other countries. So we can use that to formulate guidance to staff to say, items of an awkward size, you know, they can't be very heavy because, you know, a single person can't lift something that they can't grip and grasp. It becomes high force. So they need a second person, but after a certain weight, even a no longer safe to lift that item. So this table is in the dealer manual in section 8. Also, this table comes from the UK. I quite like it because it demonstrates to us, I think in general you can ignore the men versus women and just look at the woman one and just go, what might be acceptable for a fit, healthy person in our workplace to lift, depending on how they are carrying that item, depends on how heavy that item can be before we trigger high force. If we're able to hold it straight to us, we can go, okay, we can hold maybe 13, 15 kilos. If I'm having to reach up high or if you're thinking the reach up high, you're thinking I'm using my hands and my fingers, it now becomes about 3 kilos. So that might help you just think about what weights we can use and lift. Other things in the dealer manual that might be useful, principles of manual handling. So this is something you might want to just train your workers in. If you've got to perform a manual handling task, make sure it's planned, you know what technique you're going to be using, especially if you're using team lifting. People need to be trained to lift together. Not just anyone can just perform team lifting. You really need to be trained together in doing that. There's also some things on office ergonomics. I'm not going to go into that because we don't have time today. But if you're interested in more on office ergonomics, then you can go to the dealer manual, and there's a checklist for helping you set up your workstation to minimize the posture. So it's not going to affect the long duration. You're still going to be sitting at your desk for 8 hours a day, but a long duration is okay if we don't have an awkward posture. So we can minimize the postures by ensuring we set up our desk correctly. That's all I'm going to talk about today. Our next webinar, we will not do one in January, will be in February. My most likely topic is going to be safety strategy or something on annual planning. But if anyone has a topic, you know, if you want me to do more on, if you want a more detail on manual handling, like techniques or stretches, or if you want something on ergonomics, let me know. There's a contact email there, dealersafety@safetyaction.com.au. Feel free to send me an email and say what topic you would like. I am open to talking to you guys about whatever you want to hear about. In regards to contacting us for inquiries or anything else, the office is closing over Christmas from Tuesday the 22nd to Monday the 18th of January. I will still be checking the email address periodically, but that might be only once a week or so. So typically we try to respond to you within a business within one business day. Over that period of time, it might extend to responding to you within a week. So less communication in that time. Also, for now, we're keeping webinars on essentially the first Wednesday of the month at 1:30. If people contact me and tell me there is a different time that works for them, I'm also happy to consider moving them. And like the previous webinar, this will get uploaded onto the dealer safety section of the website, which you can access via Toyota Source under DSM, Dealer Safety Manual, or you can go onto the Safety Action website, go into client login. There's one that's a dealer safety program or dealer safety portal. Click on that, and the password is dealer safety. That will allow you access to the latest version of the dealer manual, to the newsletters, to the webinars, to legislative updates. So everything that we send out to you, hard copy every 2 months, is also on the website. So thank you very much, guys. I don't think if anyone's got any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. I don't think I see anything noted in the chat, but if you've got any questions, please put it in the chat. I'll stick around for a couple of minutes. Otherwise, thank you very much.